together for tea and some light snacks, so please feel free to enjoy that. I just wanted to make a couple of quick announcements about some other events that we have in the next week or two that may interest some of you. Let's see. This weekend, Lossie's affiliated faculty member, Carolyn Callenborn, who's also an associate faculty in design studies here at UW, is involved in several events at Edgewood College for the Day of the Dead. So this Saturday, November 1st, there's a Day of the Dead festival at Edgewood College. There's going to be a candlelight procession around the campus, live music and food, and that's free and open to the public. There are some handouts that have this exciting little postcard here back there with information. And also, that same evening, on the 1st, there's going to be a screening of a film that she produced, and she produced a film on Day of the Dead practices around Oaxaca, Mexico. That will be at Edgewood College on Saturday, and then Lossie's is sponsoring a screening of the film on Sunday evening at 7 p.m. Okay, I thought it was 6:30, 7 p.m. at the Marquee Theater, and that's also free and open to the public. In addition, on Friday, November 7th, we have a musician and women's rights activist coming to do some live music performances and talk about Honduras and the birth of the popular resistance struggle, and that will be Friday, November 7th at noon in the Law Building, Blue Bar Commons. So there's also information about that. So thanks so much for coming. I'll turn it over to our director, Francisco Escanano.
Well, thank you, Sarah. Just very briefly, welcome to Lossie's lunchtime lecture. And I hope you know that this is a recurring event. It happens most Tuesdays. Oftentimes we have other lectures different days of the week. It doesn't work out for the scheduling. But you're most welcome to come. It's an hour of conversation and good academic and intellectual stimulation, as it will be today. So please regard this as your Tuesday home, if you will. I know that some of you already do. Stefan and Ed. Today we're honored to have Erika Marin Spiota. She's a professor of geography, environmental science, and soil science at the university. She's one of I want to sort of use the metaphor of a crop of younger scholars who are coming up through the natural, the social science, research science disciplines, and she's making great contributions in that field. And she's no longer she's no longer alone, but she's one of several people who are collaborating in this enterprise. Erika is an assistant professor, as I said, in geography, Nelson Institute and the Department of Soil Science. She received a PhD in ecosystems science from UC Berkeley and completed a postdoc in geography at UC Santa Barbara before moving to the warmth of Wisconsin. Her research applies interdisciplinary methods, as you'll see today, to examine effects of human-driven consequences and changes in land cover and land use on biodiversity and biogeochemistry. I'm really eager to hear what she has to say, because my image of what happens when fields revert to forests, to use someone's, to borrow someone's title, is that the effects are quite damaging, environmentally speaking. But I think Erika has a different spin on things, and I'm really eager to listen to that today. Without further ado, I give you Erika Marin Spiota.
Volume okay in the back?
I hope so. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for coming. It's my pleasure here to talk to the LASIS group. And LASIS has been very supportive of a lot of us younger faculty on campus who are doing research in Latin America and the Caribbean, and LASIS has very generously funded a lot of my grad students going to the field and contributing data to this research. So thank you for being a good source of support on campus. And so today what I wanted to do is just share some of the research that my group has done in the Caribbean, and hopefully give you a different perspective of what happens to tropical landscapes after very intense land use. And before I do that, I want to acknowledge a number of collaborators. This has been very collaborative research. I've actually been working in the Caribbean and more specifically in Puerto Rico since I was a grad student myself. And it's been really fun going back to the same sites with different groups of grad students. Actually, we have the second generation of grad students going to these sites now. So it's nice to kind of build relationships with people there on the ground and also see how these landscapes are changing over time. And I have a number of current grad students here in the audience. Most of the data that I'm going to be showing today is actually based on the work of Dr. Peyton Smith, who finished her PhD in soil science last year, John Souther, who finished a master's in geography in May, and Emily Atkinson, who's about to defend her dissertation in December. And all three of them were funded by LASIS. So probably when you think about deforestation or you think about changes in land use and land cover in the tropics, you might conjure this image. And the first time I really got interested in thinking about the deforestation in the tropics was when I was an undergraduate student, and I was studying biology, but I was doing a minor in political science, and I was really interested in kind of environmental problems. And I took a class on development in Latin America, economic development in Latin America, and ended up reading this book by somebody who worked for the World Bank called Amazon Jungle, Green Hell to Red Desert. There's definitely a lot of interesting, I would say controversial metaphors in that title. And I've definitely given talks where I address the green hell issue of that title, but today I want to focus on the red desert. And so, kind of this image of once you cut down a tropical forest, you end up with a red desert, and it's never going to grow back. And hopefully by the end of today's talk, you realize that that's not always the case, and that's actually usually not the case in most parts of the tropics. So just a little general intro. My mouse doesn't seem to be connected. For why we care about tropical ecosystems. I'm a geographer, but I'm trained as a biologist, and so we're very interested in looking at what's happening in the tropics and environmental problems in the tropics, because they're hotspots of biodiversity. So some of the largest numbers of different types of species occurring in tropical latitudes. And they're also really important hotspots of productivity. And what I mean by productivity is basically the production of plant biomass. And so they're actually really important areas when we think about the global carbon cycle and carbon circulating through the atmosphere, being taken up through photosynthesis by plants. We have huge amounts of carbon stored in plant biomass in the tropics. And this map is color-coded, where the hotter colors, the reds and the pinks, have really high rates of productivity. So this is amount of carbon that's being taken from the atmosphere and stored in plants' biomass. And when we're interested in looking at current climate change and contributions of human activities to climate change, the tropics becomes an important place to look at, because of its very large role both in sucking carbon out of the atmosphere, storing it in plant biomass and in soils, and returning it back to the atmosphere. And so this is important. This productivity is important in terms of the carbon cycle and climate change. But just from an ecological perspective, this high productivity, this high amount of carbon, ultimately is food available for the rest of life. And so that's one of the reasons we can sustain such high diversity in the tropics, is because of this very high plant productivity. So more recently, in the context of concern about global warming, there's been a lot of focus on looking at tropical forests and their role in the carbon cycle. Because as I mentioned, they have really high rates of net primary productivity, so they're very actively interacting with carbon concentrations in the atmosphere. And they have one of the largest share of global terrestrial carbon. If we're trying to figure out where carbon is stored on our planet, a lot of it is stored in tropical forests. And so anything that might alter carbon dynamics in tropical forests is going to strongly influence our atmospheric concentrations. Question?
Tropical forests in the United States according to that map?
No, this is actually a map of net primary productivity. And so the green areas are areas of the world that have some of the highest rates of net primary productivity. And the darkest green areas are concentrated in the tropics, but there's definitely a lot of productivity in other parts of the world as well. Good question. Please do ask questions as we go along. And so if we're looking at different sources of carbon and contributions to global warming through greenhouse gases, the most important contribution worldwide is definitely industrial fossil fuel emissions of carbon, but human activities that are altering the amount of carbon that's stored in our biomass, our plant biomass and in our soils, are second most important in contributing to greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. And more recently, in the last several decades, tropical regions are dominating the flux of carbon from plant biomass and from soils to the atmosphere. So if we're trying to manage landscapes to reduce how much carbon is being emitted to the atmosphere, one of the strategies is to focus on these changes in land use in the tropics. And you can see, I actually really like this graph because it does show that the tropical regions, this is tropical Africa, Latin America, and tropical Asia, dominating the flux of carbon in the most recent decades, but that's definitely not been the story historically. Other parts of the world, United States, at the late 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, was the most important contributor of carbon emissions due to land use change. And again, this is just looking at land use change, not taking into account industrial emissions, which are still the most important source. So what's driving this carbon flux from the landscape to the atmosphere? A lot of it is deforestation. So we're basically taking all that carbon that through productivity is being stored in our plants and soils, and through deforestation, fire, forest degradation, releasing it to the atmosphere. And there's been a lot of studies trying to quantify and identify areas all over the world where this is happening. And there's a recent study by Mitch Aide from the University of Puerto Rico, who was here a couple years ago, where they were looking at changes in land use and land cover. And all these red dots are areas where the trend over the last decade has been one of forest cover, so forest cover loss. So deforestation still being a really important trend. So what's happening to these areas that are being deforested? A lot of them are being converted to agricultural crops, but in many parts of the tropics, the most important land use that comes in right after deforestation is pastures, grazing livestock, for many reasons. But here's kind of a neat reconstruction of changes in pasture cover globally over time, starting 800, 1400, 1700, 1992. And you can see the hotter red colors are greater percentage of individual pixels on a map covered in pasture. So we go from fewer parts of the world having pastures to having grazing pastures pretty much everywhere on the planet in much higher concentrations. And this is significant because we're through this major deforestation for pasture, we're reducing the amount of carbon that's stored in our plants, a lot less plant biomass in general in our pastures than we have in our forests in the background. And in addition, we're adding a new source of carbon greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, which is methane. That's produced in the guts of cattle. And as we're increasing this global production of cattle, we're increasing methane emissions to the atmosphere. And methane is actually even more powerful than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. So a lot of the work that my research group is trying to do is looking at how much carbon is stored in different parts of the landscape and how human activities influence both the reservoirs, so the stocks, how much carbon, as well as the movement of carbon among different reservoirs to really try to better understand this global carbon cycle and ultimately how we're influencing concentrations in the atmosphere and how that might affect global warming. And so one of the big questions is, with our concern with global warming, is trying to predict what the magnitude of climate change is going to be in the future. And one of the most important, we have a pretty good understanding of how much carbon we've been pumping into the atmosphere, both from industrial fossil fuel emissions and from land use and land cover change. But a lot of it is disappearing from the atmosphere. A lot of it is being taken into the oceans or taking up through this productivity in plant biomass. And when we're trying to model what the extent of climate change is going to be in the future, one of the big problems is that we don't understand how much the plant biomass in our soils can take up from the atmosphere. And I like this figure. Even if you don't understand anything about this data, you can tell there's a lot of disagreement, right? It's kind of all over the place, which is the main point of this graph. These are basically, all these lines are modeled estimates of how much carbon from the atmosphere can be taken up by plants through that productivity. So it's similar to that map that I showed you of productivity into plant biomass, projected into the future, 2100. And every line represents the results from a different model. And so you can tell that we pretty much agree what's happened in the past, but projecting into the future, it's, anything is game, right? And if we're trying to predict what might happen with global warming, if we have huge carbon uptake by the atmosphere, that's good. By the terrestrial carbon, that's good, because that's carbon we're taking out of the atmosphere. So this is good. We can predict that if this scenario is right, then global warming is not going to be as bad as we think it is. But if instead of taking up carbon, we're actually giving off more carbon, then that's a really big problem. So a lot of the research we're trying to do is reduce the uncertainty in our understanding of how terrestrial carbon uptake works so that we can better predict what might happen in the future. And so two major sources of uncertainty that lead to this spread are, first, how the amount of carbon stored in vegetation can change over time on a landscape, especially in response to a human disturbance or human activity. So how carbon accumulates and changes in forests that are regrowing after a disturbance. And then also response of what's happening to carbon in the soils. To environmental change. And so that's the two big questions that my research group is focused on. And we do a lot of work specifically focusing on below ground carbon because it actually stores 2 to 3 times more carbon than we have in all plant biomass or in the atmosphere. So it's a very significant store of carbon. And it can interact with the atmosphere, interacts with vegetation, and can actually respond on much shorter timescales to disturbance than we ever imagined. So a lot of the research that we end up doing is going to different parts of the landscape, especially working in tropical landscapes, and quantifying how much carbon is in our plant biomass above ground, but also how much carbon is stored in the soils under different land covers below ground, so that we have a better sense of how much is there. And then by measuring changes in stocks over time, we can also get an idea of how these very large carbon stocks are responding to disturbance, to try to narrow down some uncertainty in that widespread of data. So I mentioned earlier that the dominant trend of land use and land cover change in the tropics is deforestation. But there are definitely many parts of the tropics that are experiencing pretty widespread reforestation, so increase in forest cover. And this is zooming into Central America, the top of northern South America, and the Caribbean, where we've done a lot of our research. And all these blue dots are areas that in the period of the study, which was 10 years, showed long-term trend in forest increase. So even though globally deforestation is still really important, many parts of the world, and we see this in tropical Africa and tropical Asia as well, many parts of the world are increasing in forest cover. And this is an important trend in the tropics, but we've experienced that in Europe and North America already. So I couldn't find a very nice map for northern Wisconsin, but the same thing happened in northern Wisconsin. But this is a map of a county in central Massachusetts. Areas of green are forest cover, 1830 to 1985. Huge increase in forest cover across most of, this is just for one county, but we see the same trend across most of New England and most of the northeastern coast, driven by abandonment of agricultural lands as people move away from the farms to the cities, have other sources of income. We find the same thing in Europe. This is a map of farmland pre-1991 in the green. And then here for different counties, we get areas in the red, yellow, and red, where we have 50% abandonment of agricultural land leading to reforestation. So pretty important trend happening at a global scale. So following on that trend, we're interested in trying to figure out, well, how does carbon storage in plants and soils change over time as these landscapes reforest? What is the effect of the former land use? Does it matter what kind of agricultural crop, if it was pasture, if it was sugarcane, if you had banana plantations, if you had corn, how intensively it was managed? What effect does that have on these trajectories of succession as the forest is recovering? How does carbon change with reforestation? What type of species composition, what type of plants and trees do we get in these forests? And does that affect productivity in carbon storage and plant vegetation in soils? And ultimately, what we would like to be able to do to help those models and help reduce that uncertainty in the spread is come up with predictive models where we understand what's happening at a particular site, but can we predict what's happening across the tropical landscapes by understanding some of the effects of these different variables. So I'm going to take you to the Caribbean, and we'll look at some case studies of where we've done a lot of our work. And the Caribbean is an excellent place to do this research. We've done most of our research in Puerto Rico and also in St. Croix, part of the US Virgin Islands. And this is a really good place to do this type of research, especially looking at agricultural abandonment and reforestation, because these islands have experienced massive agricultural abandonment and reforestation. And we have really good historical records. Many parts of the tropics have had pretty dynamic changes in forest cover, but we don't really have very good historical records. So it's really hard to know what happened on that landscape in the past. But in the Caribbean, and especially Puerto Rico, we've got centuries worth of historical data on forest cover even species composition because of a very long-term presence of forestry research and management, excuse me, on that island. So let's look at deforestation and reforestation in the Caribbean. And so this is a historical photograph from the 1940s, what most of Puerto Rico looked like at that time period. We had 90% deforestation of the island for mostly pasture, sugarcane, and small-scale kind of subsistence agriculture, pretty massive deforestation island-wide. So another historical photograph of Puerto Rico, where you see one of the dominant land uses, especially in the flatlands, was sugarcane plantation. So we go from 90% of the island being completely deforested to today having 40 to 60% of the island in forest cover. 40% at the island-wide, and some areas 60% where we work. So massive reforestation. So definitely just even thinking about those numbers and looking at these pictures, this landscape, 40, 50, 60 years ago looked like this. And now we have massive increase in forest cover. Some of the main drivers for this have been changes in the economy from one of these agricultural economy to an industry and services economy. Also, widespread migration from rural areas to urban areas. But in the 40s and 50s, a lot of this natural reforestation, most of this is natural reforestation, was driven also by migrations from the island to the mainland, driven by economic drivers. So this actually gives us a really nice opportunity